This is my nerdy coffee table makeover. So I bought a coffee table from a thrift store and made it over to make it into a nice subtle nerdy table. Started off with something that was pretty beat up. I think I paid $7 for this. And it's got quite a lot of good wood on it. So I was able to salvage everything. I didn't have to put any new wood on it. Stripped off all the layers that were on top. Mainly used a orbital sander with dust mask and a vacuum cleaner, a shop vac, and hand sand as well. So now I start to make it into something nerdy. And so I wanted something that kind of fit my family. And so we're big fans of Doctor Who, Rick and Morty, Batman, Invader Zim, Star Wars, and a few others that you might recognize in here. And so basically I took silhouettes of each of the things I wanted to make and I cut them out onto masking tape. The first couple I cut out on the wood itself, and that ended up being a lot more of a challenge than I expected. The X-Acto knife kept catching into the grain of the wood and just following the grain rather than following the design I wanted. So I moved over to a cutting pad, and that X-Acto knife over there on the right there, that's really cool. It's actually two blades in one knife, so you can cut straight parallel lines. So like here for cutting legs and arms and stuff, it gives you nice even legs and arms and stuff. But I ended up doing it freehand anyway, because, you know, why do it the easy way, even if you got the cool tool. But got through it and did basically a couple of pieces of tape together to give me something big enough to carve out my picture. And then I put the silhouette over the tape, traced it out, and then lift up the silhouette, and then peel away the scrap tape, and then peel away the tape that I needed. So here I'm getting rid of all the scrap, and this left with what I want. And then I'm going to transfer this from the cutting surface over to the table. And cutting surface, this is just a self-healing mat that comes in really handy. And there's a lot of detail on some of these, so I ended up having to get out a magnifying glass and take a closer look to get those arms and fingers and stuff. And then once I peeled it all off, I moved it over to the table, and what this is going to do is I'll stain the table a darker color, basically pretty close to the original color, sort of a red oak color. And then I'm going to leave the masking tape on there while I'm doing the staining, and this will give me a dark table with some light silhouettes on it. And I think that'll be a nice, subtle, nerdy look. Not the in-your-face, bright color nerdy that we're used to, but something a little bit more subtle. Here we go. Here's the cool knife. And so this is the one that makes the straight lines. And so I'll use these straight lines for a couple of areas where I needed to repair, like the police box, the Tardis, because I had accidentally cut off some of the rims of the Tardis. And we'll just put that over there on top and give the Tardis a little bit more shape, because the original silhouette was really just a little box and I wanted it to be more recognizable as a Tardis. So I gave it some more definitions on the sides. Okay, so now that I've got the Tardis modified, I'm going to go ahead and lay down a couple more pieces of tape, and we'll do the next emblem. And you'll recognize this one pretty quick. It's the Flash. And so this one's got parallel lines that go on the outside, so I want to leave a ring on the outside. And that's going to be really tough to do with the standard X-Acto knife, so I use that cool double-bladed one. And I narrowed it down to where the X-Acto knife blades fit the width of the circle, and then I just trace the circle, And it helps if you tape it down a little better. I didn't tape it down quite enough, so it got a little squirrely on me, but it still came out looking good. And then once I finish that, then just do the thunderbolt through the middle. And make sure you don't cut through the original circle. I want to leave that intact. And then just get rid of all the scrap material. And transfer the silhouette to the table. And this one doesn't have as many fine details, so it's a little bit easier to transfer. Just get rid of all those scraps and bingo! Now you can recognize what it is. And of course, if the Shazam movie's any good, we could always just call it Shazam instead of Flash. Just clean up that circle a little bit. Like I said, it'd be better if it got taped down right the first time, but it cleaned up nice. And just had to be careful to get the edges off so I didn't tear it as I lifted it. Okay, for tools, I use a regular X-Acto knife. I've got the dual blade X-Acto knife that I talked about a little bit. Painter's masking tape. Scissors, just to give me a nice edge on the masking tape. Pencil to draw some silhouettes. A steel carpenter square. I use a metal one because that way I can follow it with the X-Acto blade and get nice straight lines. And that's about it. Here are all the symbols laid out and put on their little pedestals, and they are ready for staining. Each symbol gets a little stand. Alright, so here we're going to get the stain ready. So I'm going to use a red oak stain, and it'll go over the tape, the painter's tape, and that way it'll leave a lighter surface for everything underneath the painter's tape, all the silhouettes. So it'll be light silhouettes instead of dark silhouettes. And I'll just put the stain on pretty quick with a chip brush, so just a cheapo, like less than $1 brush. Just something that doesn't leave hairs behind. It's good, because you're just going to wipe the stain off with a rag anyway. I do use gloves to make sure I don't stain my hands. I don't want to walk around with brown stained hands for a couple weeks. And I just basically coat everything over, then let it sit for about 10 minutes, and then come along with a cloth and wipe everything off. I actually have one cloth that's already got some stain on it, so use that one first, and then I'll come back with a little bit cleaner cloth and get the rest of the stain so it looks nice and sharp. And then once everything's settled in, I'll go ahead and peel off all the painter's tape and reveal the silhouettes. And then once that's done, I will give it a couple of coats of finish, and it'll look pretty good. One thing that did kind of go wrong on the finish, when I was doing the finish, I started with the PolyAcrilic, and it looked amazing. It just looked like glass. But then I went to put on a second coat of PolyAcrilic, and it was really humid outside, and I ended up with a lot of bubbles in the PolyAcrilic. And so I ended up having to sand the PolyAcrilic completely off, and the humidity didn't go down, and I did have a bit of a deadline for this table. So I ended up having to use a spray-on finish, and it was polyurethane, but it was a satin instead of a high gloss, so it didn't look quite as sharp. The PolyAcrilic looked a lot better, It's a little bit harder to put on because you put it on with a brush and you have to be real careful to not leave any streak marks or anything. But, and that's definitely the finish I would have preferred for this. But given the timetable, I ended up having to go with spray on just because it dries quick and it wasn't as sensitive to the humidity as the brush on polyacrylic. Here you'll notice I put this stain on pretty thick, which is what you want. You want it to absorb into the wood. And I went ahead and painted it out to the edges. Although what I didn't sand the edges off and clean them up really well. They weren't damaged too bad. But there were a couple of nicks and scrapes that I thought would have filled in with this stain, and they did not. So I ended up having to paint those with like an acrylic paint, and then come back and made sure and hit those with the final finish so that they were sealed up really well. But they looked all right. I mean, the acrylic paint was easy to match, so I matched it to the stain. But what I found was the edges weren't real wood. They were this like plasticky wood grain stuff. And if you sanded it at all, the grain just disappeared. There was no thickness to sand. So the paint had to do. I could have come back and done trim, but again, time sensitive, didn't have a whole lot of time for this project. Had to get it out for somebody's birthday. Alright, so basically let this sit here for a couple minutes. Okay, so the stain has soaked in for about 10 minutes. And now I'm going to wipe it off with a kind of a dirty stain rag. It's a rag that I've already used with this stain before. I'm going to get most of the stain off here. And then I'll come back with a cleaner rag and get the last of the stain off. Gives it a nice finish. And the stain does a good job of highlighting all the different grain in the table. And I made sure and got real clean around each of the painter's tape areas. And one thing to note, with this technique, you don't get really clean lines. The painter's tape's pretty good, but stain soaks into the wood, so it's going to soak under the painter's tape. But I wanted this to be a nice, subtle kind of thing anyway. So it's alright that it faded in. It looks kind of like an old grainy TV. Looks pretty good. And so each symbol has its own little pedestal that goes on. And one thing to note, you don't want to leave this painter's tape out in the sun for a couple of hours or days. It will embed itself into the wood, and then it'll just have a mess. You'll have to come back and try to get the residue off of there, and that's going to be really hard to do without sanding. And if you sand it, you're going to have to end up restaining it, and that means retaping everything. So don't leave the tape on there too long, and don't leave the tape in the sun. Just a couple lessons from experience there. Another drawback of doing the carving on the table rather than on the self-healing board, there were some lines around like the Tardis and the bat symbol that were really obvious once the stain got in them. It doesn't look there. It doesn't look really great. The ones that were done on the self-healing, nice clean lines all around the silhouette. The ones that were carved on the table, you've got some gouges around the carving where I went long to get nice straight lines. So another lesson there, do your carving on the self-healing mat and transfer. Otherwise you'll be following the grain and you'll end up with a bunch of extra lines that you don't really want. I think I've got some close-ups that I'll put in the video at the end and you'll be able to see those lines, especially if you look at the Tardis and the bat symbol. Those are two that I carved on the table. Alright, but if you look, looks great. Got nice little silhouettes. It's nerdy, but kind of a subtle nerdy. And once you put a nice shiny finish on there, it'll be even more subtle because the silhouettes will disappear at certain lights. Alright, I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope it inspires you to do something nerdy and creative. Have a good day.